Welcome, this is What is Voodoo Full Breakdown Part 2. Sorry for the delay. If you haven't seen Part 1, the link is in the description below. Watch that before this. So let's continue. Another African origin in Hoodoo is the Mojo Bag. The Mojo Bag in Hoodoo has West and Central African origins. The word mojo comes from the West African word mojuba. Mojo bags are called Grigri bag or Toby conjurer bag and Mojo hand. Another West African influence in Hoodoo is Islam. As a result of the transatlantic slave trade, some West African Muslims that practice Islam were enslaved in the United States prior to their arrival to the American South. West African Muslims blended Islamic beliefs with traditional West African spiritual practices. On the plantations in the American South, enslaved West African Muslims kept some of their traditional Islamic culture. They practiced the Islamic prayers, wore turbans, and the men wore the traditional wide-leg pants. Some enslaved West African Muslims practiced hoodoo. Instead of using Christian prayers in the creation of charms, Islamic prayers were used. Enslaved black Muslim conjure doctors' Islamic attire was different from the other slaves, which made them easy to identify and ask for conjure services regarding protection from slaveholders. The Mandingo were the first Muslim ethnic group imported from Syria at Leon in West Africa to the Americas. Mandingo people were known for their powerful conjure bags called Grigri, called Mojo bags in the United States. Some of the Mandingo people were able to carry their Grigri bags with them when they boarded slave ships heading to the Americas, bringing the practice to the United States. Enslaved people went to enslaved black Muslims for conjure services, requesting them to make Grigri bags for protection against slavery. The West African Aruba origins are evident in Hoodoo. For example, the Aruba trickster deity called Eshu Elegba resides at the Crossroads, and the Yoruba people leave offerings for Eshu Elegba at the Crossroads. As stated previously, the Crossroads has spiritual power in Hoodoo, and rituals are performed at the Crossroads, and there is a spirit that resides at the Crossroads to leave offerings for. However, the spirit that resides at the Crossroads in Hoodoo is not named Eshu Elegba, because many of the African names of deities were lost during slavery, but the belief that a spirit resides at the Crossroads and one should provide offerings to it originates from West Africa. The Aruba Crossroads spirit Eshu Elegba became the man of the Crossroads in Hoodoo. Folklorist Newbell Niles Puckett recorded a number of Crossroads rituals in Hoodoo practiced among African Americans in the South, and explained its meaning. Puckett wrote, "Possibly this custom of sacrificing at the crossroads is due to the idea that spirits like men travel the highways and would be more likely to hit upon the offering at the crossroads than elsewhere." In addition to leaving the offerings and performing rituals at the crossroads, sometimes spiritual work or spells are left at the crossroads to remove unwanted energies. In Annapolis, Maryland, archaeologists uncovered evidence for West African and Central African practices. A hoodoo spiritual bundle that contained nails, a stone axe, and other items were embedded 4 feet in the streets of Maryland near the Capitol. The axe inside the hoodoo bundle showed a cultural link to the Yoruba people's deity Shango. Shango was and is a feared Orisha in Yoruba land because he is associated with lightning and thunder, and this fear and respect towards thunder and lightning survived in African American communities. Folklorist Puckett wrote, "And thunder denotes an angry creator." Puckett recorded a number of beliefs surrounding the fear and respect for thunder and lightning in African American community. In hoodoo, objects struck by lightning hold a great power. However, the name Shango and other African deity names were lost during slavery. Therefore, the name Shango does not exist in hoodoo, but just the name the thunder god. Enslaved and free blacks in New York were known among the whites in the area to take an oath to thunder and lightning. During the 1741 slave conspiracy in New York, African American men took an oath to thunder and lightning. Other Yoruba influences in hoodoo is the use of iron horseshoes. Horseshoes are made from iron and metal. In West Africa, blacksmiths are respected because they are connected to the spirit of metal iron. Among the Aruba, the Osher spirit Ogun corresponds to iron, and Ugun is called the god of iron. West African people enslaved in the United States kept the respect for enslaved blacksmiths on the plantation and recognition for iron. Horseshoes are made from metal and are used for protection in hoodoo. In Maryland, archaeologists unearthed at the White House artifacts that linked to the Aruba people's spiritual belief and practice in the reverence of Ugun, which is why African Americans incorporate horseshoes and metal tools in hoodoo, because there is a spirit that corresponds to metal that can be invoked for protection from physical and spiritual harm. Aruba cultural influences survived in hoodoo, but the names and symbols of Orisha spirits are not present in hoodoo because that information was lost during slavery. Therefore, just the natural elements that correspond to each Orisha remain. In addition, at the King's Mill plantation in Williamsburg, Virginia, enslaved blacksmiths created spoons that historians suggest have West African symbols carved onto them that have a spiritual, cosmological meaning. In Alexandria, Virginia, historians found in a slave cabin a wrought iron figure made by an enslaved blacksmith in the 18th century, which looks similar to Ugun statues made by blacksmiths in West Africa by the Edo, Fon, Mande and Yoruba people. West African blacksmiths enslaved in the United States were highly respected and feared by enslaved blacks because they had the ability to forge weapons. Gabriel Prosser was an African American slave in Richmond, Virginia, and was a blacksmith in 1800. Gabriel Prosser planned a slave revolt in Virginia. Historians assert that Prosser became the leader of the planned rebellion because he was a blacksmith, and enslaved people respected and feared blacksmiths because of their ability to forge weapons and their connection to the spirit of the iron. Prosser and other enslaved blacksmiths made weapons for the rebellion, But the revolt never happened, because two slaves informed the authorities. Hoodoo also has voodoo origins. For example, a primary ingredient used in gopher dust is snake skins. Snakes are revered in West African spiritual practices because they represent divinity. The West African voodoo water spirit Mame Wata holds a snake in one hand. This reverence for snakes came to the United States during the slave trade, and in Hoodoo, snake skins are used in the preparations of conjure powders. Puckett explained that the origin of snake reverence in Hoodoo originates from snake honouring in West Africa's voodoo tradition. It was documented from a former slave in Missouri that conjurers took dried snakes and frogs and ground them into powders to hoodoo people. A conjurer made a powder from a dried snake and a frog and put it in a jar and buried it under the stems of the target's house to hoodoo the person. When the targeted individual walked over the jar, they had pain in their legs. Snakes in Hoodoo are used for healing, protection, and to curse people. Water spirits called Simbi are also revered in Hoodoo, which comes from the West African and Central African spiritual practices. When Africans were brought to the United States to be enslaved, they blended African spiritual beliefs with Christian baptismal practices. Enslaved Africans prayed to the spirit of the water and not to the Christian God when they baptized church members. Some African Americans prayed to Simbi water spirits during their baptismal services. The West African Ligbo origins are also evident in Hoodoo. Ambrose Madison, a prominent planter in colonial Virginia and grandfather of U.S. President James Madison, died at his plantation, Mount Pleasant, as a result of an unknown illness. According to research from historian Douglas Chambers, it was believed by Ambrose Madison's family that he was poisoned by 3 of his Ligbo slaves. The evidence that Ligbo slaves poisoned Madison is limited. However, the book does offer some information about Ligbo people in Virginia. According to academic research, the majority of West Africans imported to Virginia during the slave trade were Ligbo. The Ligbo people's spiritual practice is called Ordinai. That was brought to the United States during the transatlantic slave trade. Butchered that one. Ligbo people had their own herbal knowledge and spiritual practices that shaped Hoodoo in the United States. Communication with ancestors is an important practice in Hoodoo that originated from West and Central Africa. Ligbo people believe family members can reincarnate back into the family line. To ensure this process, proper burial ceremonies are performed. Ligbo people and other ethnic groups in West Africa have 2 burials for their family members, one physical and one spiritual. Burial ceremonies of African Americans was influenced by the culture of Ligbo peoples. The belief in the care and respect for the dead and ancestors. If family members were not given a proper burial, the soul suffered in the afterlife. African Americans in Virginia practiced the 2 burial ceremonies of their dead that was influenced by the Ligbo people. The first burial is physical, which is placing the body in the grave, and the second burial is spiritual, which involves celebrating the person's life before they died and mourning their loss. These practices ensured relatives would return to the ancestral realm or reincarnate back into the family, or to reincarnate back into the family. Voodoo practices also include how African Americans bury their dead. The pouring of libations over an ancestor or recently deceased family member's grave is a way to honor and elevate their spirit. This practice is done in Virginia and other African American communities in the United States, which originated from West Africa. Other spiritual practices of African Americans in Virginia can be traced to the Lugbo people. The conjure hoodoo practices of black root workers in Virginia was documented in slave narratives. For example, some black conjurer doctors used conjure canes to contact spirits. The conjure cane documented in Virginia had a snake wrapped around it. Black root workers and Lugbo woodcrafters in Virginia carved snakes onto their canes. Some African Americans in Virginia are descendants of Lugbo people, and their conjure practices are similar. For example, pythons are revered amongst the Lugbo because they are messengers of God and represent divinity. The snake reverence among Lugbo people was brought to Virginia during the transatlantic slave trade. Other conjure practices traced to the Lugbo people is the practice of burying jars and other items to cause misfortune on people. All the people had to do was to walk over it, and the magic caused a negative effect in their life. This practice of hiding spiritual items to cause misfortune was found in other parts of Africa. At Stagville Plantation, located in Durham County, North Carolina, archaeologists found artifacts made by enslaved African Americans that linked to spiritual practices found in West Africa. The artifacts found was a divining stick, walking stick, and cowrie shells. Stagville Plantation was owned by a wealthy slaveholding family called the Benihan family. They enslaved 900 African American people. Stagville was one of many large slave plantations in the American South. Inside the Benihan house, a walking stick was found, placed in between the walls to curse the Benihan family. An enslaved person secretly placed a walking stick to put evil spirits on their enslavers, putting a curse on the family for enslaving them. The walking stick was carved into an image of a West African snake spirit called Dambala. In West Central Africa and African American communities, only initiates trained in the secrets of the serpent and spirits were allowed to have a conjurer stick. These sticks conjured illness and healing, and the spirit of a conjure stick can warn the conjurer of impending danger. Cowrie shells were found on the site and was used by enslaved African Americans to connect with the spiritual element of water, to ensure spiritual guidance over bodies of water. In West Africa, cowrie shells were used for money and correspondence to African water spirits. Other African cultural survivals among the Gula people is giving their children African names. Linguistics noticed identical or similar sounding names in the Gulagishi nation that can be traced to the Sierra Leone, a country in West Africa. Some African Americans in South Carolina and Georgia continue to give their children African names. This is done for spiritual and cultural reasons. The spiritual reason is for their ancestors to provide their children spiritual power and spiritual protection. The cultural reason is so their children will know what region of Africa their ancestry is from. The practice of carving snakes onto conjure sticks to remove curses, evil spirits, and bring healing was found in African American communities in the Sea Islands among the Gulagishi people. Snake reverence in African American hoodoo originated from West African societies. Another practice in hoodoo that has its origins from West Africa is to moisten conjure bags and luck balls with whiskey or rum. It is believed that conjure bags and luck balls have a spirit, and to keep its spirit alive, conjurers feed them whiskey once a week. The practice has its roots from the Guinea coast of Africa. The practice of foot track magic in hoodoo has its origins from Ghana. A person's foot track is used to send someone away by mixing their foot track with herbs, roots, and insect-specific ingredients used in hoodoo to send someone away, and grind into a powder and place said powder in a container and throw it into a flowing river that leaves town, and in a few days the person will leave town. Among the Tishi people in Ghana, spirit possession is not limited to people, but objects, inanimate and animate, can become possessed by spirits. This same belief among blacks in the South was documented by folklorist Puckett. Archaeologists in New York discovered continued West Central African burial practices in a section of Lower Manhattan, New York City, which is now the location of the African Burial Ground National Monument. Archaeologists and historians noted about 15,000 Africans were buried in a section of Lower Manhattan that was named the Negroes' Burial Ground. Over 500 artifacts were excavated showing continued African traditions in New York City's African American community. Some of the artifacts came from West Africa. Only 419 Africans buried were exhumed, and from their discoveries, archaeologists and historians found African cultural retention in African American burial practices. At the site of 146 beads were found, and 9 within that number came from West Africa. The other beads were manufactured in Europe, but were used by enslaved and free people for their burial practices. Pardon me. Incorporating an African spiritual interpretation to European beads. For example, many of the Africans buried, including women, men, and children, had beads, waist beads, and wristlets. Beads in African society bring protection of wealth, fertility, and health to the wearer. In West Africa, African women wear beads around their waist for beauty. At the African burial ground, archaeologists found beads wrapped around the waist of the burial remains of an enslaved African American woman. Also, about 200 shells were found with African remains. Beads, shells, and iron bars are associated with the Aruba deity Olukun, a spirit that owns the sea. Shells are associated with water and help the soul transition in the afterlife because seashells help the soul move from the realm of the living into the realm of the dead. Which is associated with water. Other artifacts found at the African burial ground were shiny objects and reflective materials. These were used by Africans to communicate with spirits because shiny and reflective materials were able to capture the flash of the spirit. Between 1626 and 1660s, the majority of Africans imported to colonial New York were from the Congo, Angolan region, because New York was colonized by the Dutch. Historians and archaeologists found Congo-related artifacts at the African burial ground, such as Minkizi and Nikizi bundles buried with African remains. These Nikizi and Minkizi bundles became the conjure bags in Voodoo. After 1679, the majority of Africans imported to the colonial New York were from West Africa because colonial rule of New York shifted from the Dutch to the English in 1664. West Africans imported to the colony were Akan, Fon, Yoruba, and other ethnic groups. These diverse African ethnic groups brought their traditional cultures with them and adorned their dead with adornments made from American materials, but had an African design and meaning to them. Archaeologists found a Ghanaian burial practice that was a funerary clay pipe with a Ghanaian design called Ibua was found with the remains of an African American woman. In addition, archaeologists excavated Mojo Bags at the site. The conjuring bundles had crystals, roots, beads, feathers, and animal parts and other items to communicate with spirits and for protection. Other artifacts found at the site that link to West Africa researchers suggest the finding of Akan Sankofa symbol found on a coffin. The Akan Sankofa Adinkra symbol means to remember one's ancestors and to look to the future, while not forgetting the past. In addition, West African spiritual beliefs mixed with the Christian faith and free and enslaved West Africans started their own African Methodist Episcopal Zion churches, I can't pronounce that, in New York City. The African burial ground reserved a location called the Ancestral Libation Chamber for people to perform spiritual ceremonies, to pay their respects for the enslaved and free Africans buried at the monument. African Americans and other African descended peoples continue to travel to the African burial ground from across the country and around the world and perform libation ceremonies to honor the 15,000 plus African people buried in New York City. The Ashanti people in West Africa also had their own cross symbol that influenced African Americans. Interpretations of the Christian cross, African American spirituality was influenced by the culture of the Ashanti people. Baptismal services of African Americans during and after chattel slavery was similar to the Ashanti people's water immersions in West Africa, where African water spirits are called. In African American baptismal services and in West African water immersions, both wear white clothing and are taken place at rivers where the water spirits reside. However, in black communities, baptismal services there was a blend of Christian, West African and Central African influence of African American baptismal services. Other West African influences in African American spirituality is seen in quilt making. African American women made quilts, incorporating West African crosses and the Bakongo cross of the Congo cosmogram. For example, an African American woman named Harriet Powers made quilts using Bakongo and other West African symbols. On one of the Harriet Powers quilts was a cross with 4 suns showing Bakongo influence. Quilting the Congo cosmogram onto her quilts. Other African symbols were seen in Powers' quilts. However, scholars suggest Harriet Powers' cross symbols may also be a West African cross, as West Africans also had crosses as symbols, but the meaning and use of said crosses in West Africa was different from the Bakongo people in Central Africa. Fon influence and artistic style were seen in Powers' quilts as well. Harriet Powers was born enslaved in Georgia in 1837, and scholars suggested Powers may have been in Bakongo or Dahomey descent. African American quilts are influenced by American quilt making and West African designs. Adinkra symbols and other African symbols are sewn into the fabrics for spiritual purposes. Quilt makers in the African American community also sewed mojo bags and placed roots, bones, and other items inside bags for protection. Another example was Louisa Frances Combs. Louisa Frances Combs was born in Guinea and came to the United States in the 1860s. Her quilts incorporate West African features of a red striped pattern, patchwork, and 2 broad asymmetrical panels. This pattern design is similar to the Mandi people's religious concepts that evil spirits travelled in a straight path, and to protect oneself from evil spirits, broken lines and fragmented shapes are sewn into fabrics and quilts. Some of the meanings of the African symbols sewed into the quilts were held secret. Scholars suggest some of the African American women who made these quilts might have been in a secret society that retained the true spiritual meanings of the symbols seen in their quilts. Only initiates trained in quilt making received the spiritual meanings of the African symbols. Some of the symbols mention the Crossroads, the Congo cosmogram, and the ancestors. Certain colours are used in the quilts to protect from evil and invoke ancestral spirits. Scholars interviewed an African American quilt maker in Oregon and have found Aruba inspirations in their quilts. Her quilts look similar to the Yagungan regalia patterns of the Yoruba people in West Africa, where she incorporated striped piercing techniques that pay tribute to her ancestors. Zora Neale Hurston, an African-American cultural anthropologist and hoodoo initiate, reported in her essay Hoodoo in America that conjure had its highest development along the Gulf Coast, particularly in New Orleans and its surrounding rural areas. These regions were settled by Haitan immigrants at the time of the overthrow of the French rule in Haiti, by Toussaint Louverture, 1,300 Haitians of African descent, along with their white ex-masters, were driven out, and the nearest French refuge was the province of Louisiana, then under Spanish control. African Haitians brought with them the conjure rituals modified by European cultural influences, such as the Catholicism, while some retained Haitian voodoo practices, others developed their own regional hoodoo. Unlike the continental North American slaves in the Caribbean islands were encouraged to make themselves as much at home as possible in their bondage, and thus retained more of their West African customs and language. Hoodoo practices at Congo Square were documented by folklorist Puckett. African Americans poured libations at the four corners of Congo Square at midnight during a dark moon. In New Orleans, an African American found under their bed a hollowed out acorn with hair from a dead person inside it, and the four sides of the acorn was pierced with four holes, and two small chicken feathers were drawn through the acorn, which were crossed inside it. According to Puckett, the Acorn Charm was similar to the Kutchnut charms made by people in the West African countries of Ghana. The Haitian Revolution and the conjure used during the Revolution inspired other slave revolts in the United States. For example, in 1822, a free black named Denmark Vesey planned a slave revolt in Charleston, South Carolina, that was molded after the Haitian Revolution. Denmark Vesey, a carpenter and formerly enslaved person, allegedly planned an enslaved insurrection to coincide with Bastille Day in Charleston, South Carolina in 1822. Vesey modeled his rebellion after the successful 1791 slave revolution in Haiti. His plans called for his followers to execute the white enslavers, liberate the city of Charleston, and then sell to Haiti before the white power structure could retaliate. Denmark Vesey's co-conspirator was enslaved Gula conjurer named Gula Jack. Gula Jack was known to carry a conjure bag with him at all times for his spiritual protection. For the slaves' spiritual protection, Gula Jack gave them route work instructions for a possible slave revolt planned by his co-conspirator Denmark Vesey. Gula Jack instructed the enslaved to eat a peanut butter-like mash, each parched cornmeal, and carry crab claws for their protection. The plan was to free those enslaved through armed resistance and the use of conjure. Denmark Vesey and Gula Jack were not successful because their plan was revealed and stopped. From other historical research and records, Gula Jack performed a ceremony and made the enslaved eat a half-cooked fowl. One of the slaves said that he could not talk about the conspiracy as Jack bound his speech with conjure. According to records, Jack charmed enslaved men to join the revolt. And that's all I can cover for now. The information on this topic is massive, and there's so much history with it all, etc. And maybe I'll cover various bits of it in other sections in later videos. But I hope you found this video insightful and educational. If so, hit the like, and if you're new to this channel, then please subscribe. It would be great to have you here. And also, I keep forgetting, but you can also support me via my Patreon page. The link is in the description below. And so until the next video, take care and be well.